the Soviet scientists who kept a severed head alive. It was 1928 in Moscow. In a cold and cheesy laboratory, Bryukhonenko leaned over a metal tray holding a severed dog's head. Witnesses later claimed the eyes blinked. It reacts to light and blinked again. It flinches when something touches its nose. The dog is, by any reasonable definition of the word, alive. And the man behind it, he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Now, before we get into the guts of this, and trust me, there are guts, let's take a second to appreciate the general vibe of Soviet science in the early 20th century. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the newly formed Soviet government had a very specific agenda for its scientists. Forget politely chipping away at the edges of human knowledge. The Soviets wanted to conquer death itself. Genuinely. That was their goal in the 1920s. Full on look death in the face, spit on its shoes, and walk away. I think this wasn't just ambition. It should be ideological. Maybe a bit futuristic. If the Soviet Union could prove that science and communism together could defeat mortality, well, that was one hell of a propaganda win. So they provided many resources to their scientists and said, go on, guys. Some governments have a rainy day fund. The Soviet Union had a conquer death fund. Completely normal budget allocation. Nothing to see here.
Budget.
And Dr. Sergei Sergeyevich Bryukhonenko did it. In his life, he was deeply fascinated by one very specific question. What exactly keeps us alive? And more importantly, could you bottle it? His life's work was dedicated to understanding the mechanics of circulation. Not in a dusty textbook kind of way, but in a wild, experimental, morally questionable kind of way. The kind of way that gets a man either a Nobel Prize or a stern talking to. In Bryukhonenko's case, it was both. His crowning achievement, which he began developing in the early 1920s, was a device he called the Autojektor. Now, you might be thinking, sounds like a fancy projector for autos. It was not. The Autojektor was, in essence, the world's first artificial heart and lung machine, capable of pumping oxygenated blood through a living body independently of the heart or the lungs doing any of the work. In modern terms, it was like an artificial heart that pumps blood through the body. Your heart crashes? Don't worry, we've got a backup running. Now, Bryukhonenko didn't just slap this thing together and call it a day. He spent years developing the Autojektor, testing it on dogs, observing, adjusting, failing, then trying again. Standard science stuff, just with considerably more blood than your average chemistry class. And then came the experiment that would make history. In the late 1920s, Bryukhonenko and his team severed the head of a dog completely from its body. Like no strings attached. No sneaky little blood vessel still running behind the scenes. The head was removed carefully and placed on a cold tray and connected directly to the Autojektor. The Autojektor did its job well and pumped oxygenated blood in and out of the head via tubes attached to the carotid arteries and jugular veins. And then they waited a bit. After a while, the head woke up. Researchers observed the severed dog head responding to external stimuli. Light shone in its eyes caused them to react. A hammer tapped near its ears caused the head to flinch. When citric acid was applied to its lips, the head grimaced. It appeared to experience discomfort. It appeared to be aware. I don't know if he experienced it in the sense that we understand it, but perhaps he felt the pain. Now, some of you are probably thinking, okay, but this is just a dog. Sure. But keep that thought warm. We'll be coming back to it. The footage of these experiments was captured on film, and in 1940, this film, titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms, was actually screened at Oxford University in England. You know, to the scientists and scholars there, the very people who are supposed to be the calm, rational voice of reason in all things. Reportedly, there was significant disturbance in the audience. One account suggests that some attendees straight up left mid-screening. Can I go home now? Please. Can I just go home? I think the issue will become more complicated at this stage. Because Bryukhonenko wasn't the only person conducting these kinds of experiments in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Petrovich Demikhov was a Soviet experimental surgeon who worked in Moscow in the 1940s and 50s. And if Bryukhonenko was the guy who kept a head alive, Demikhov was the guy who decided that one head simply wasn't enough. Between 1954 and 1959, Demikhov performed a series of experiments in which he grafted the head, shoulders, and front legs of one dog onto the neck of another, creating a functioning two-headed dog. Not a metaphor, an actual literal functional two-headed dog. Both heads could lap milk, both heads could react to stimuli, and by all appearances, both heads had some form of awareness of their situation. Which, again, raises some really unfortunate philosophical questions. He created at least 20 such animals. Most survived only days before immune rejection set in. But some survived longer. One pair reportedly lived for 29 days before rejection took hold. And throughout that time, both heads were observed eating, drinking, and looking around with what can generously be described as understandable confusion. Hold on. Before you grab your pitchforks for Demikhov, hear me out. Buried underneath the nightmare fuel, this guy was actually a genuine pioneer of modern surgery. Demikhov's two-headed dog experiments were, in a deranged way, essentially early groundwork for understanding organ transplantation and rejection. The transplant surgeons who figured out how to give you a new kidney? They owe a weird and uncomfortable debt to this man. Doesn't make the dogs feel better about it. But there you go. So at this point you might be asking, alright, dogs are one thing, what about humans? And that is a very reasonable question to ask, and also exactly the kind of question that leads to people losing sleep, so me. Because here's the part of the story that history books tend to skim over. Bryukhonenko's Autojektor research was not exclusively limited to canines. Soviet medical literature from the period contains documented references to attempts at human resuscitation using the Autojektor device in cases of sudden cardiac death, specifically on individuals who had been declared clinically dead for short periods of time. I think the Soviet government was not exactly transparent about the details and boundaries of these experiments. So pinning down the exact nature and number of human trials is, let's say, murky. But what is documented is that at least one official Soviet medical paper from the 1930s described autojector-assisted revival attempts on human subjects in clinical settings. Whether any of those subjects were aware of their surroundings during the process is something that nobody has been able to confirm. And honestly, probably nobody wanted to ask too loudly. In the 1960s, not only ordinary people but also scientists had boundless imaginations. People who believed they could achieve anything from establishing colonies on other planets to seeking immortality were everywhere. If only we had that kind of energy today. Now, across the Atlantic, American scientists were watching all of this with what we might politely call intense professional interests. And one man in particular decided he was going to take things a step further. Dr. Robert Joseph White, Cleveland, Ohio. Neurosurgeon, Rhodes Scholar, actual advisor to the Vatican on medical ethics. Starting in the 1960s, White began conducting his own isolated brain perfusion experiments at Case Western Reserve University. Similar in concept to Bryukhonenko's work, but refined and expanded. White managed to keep isolated monkey brains functioning outside of the body, connected to a circulatory support system, recording active brainwave activity for extended periods. The brains were showing signs of consciousness on an EEG machine, detached from any body. White himself described the isolated brains as being, quote, in a state of isolation from the environment, but not necessarily unconscious. The operation itself was, from a purely technical standpoint, extraordinary. White and his team managed to attach the blood vessels of the donor head to the circulatory system of the recipient body, essentially keeping the transplanted head alive and perfused. The monkey regained consciousness after the procedure. It could track movement with its eyes. It could bite. It responded to stimuli. The problem, and it is a significant problem, is that White's team had no way to reconnect the spinal cord. So the transplanted head had a fully functioning body below it, and absolutely no ability to control any of it. The monkey survived for 9 days before the immune system did what immune systems do. Rejection set in, and it was over. White spent the remainder of his career advocating for human head transplant research. He called it a cephalosomatic anastomosis, because calling it a head transplant at a medical conference apparently gets you some looks. He died in 2010, having never achieved his goal. In 2015, an Italian neurosurgeon named Sergio Canavero announced to the world that he was ready to perform the first human head transplant within 2 years. He called the project Heaven. Most probably, he was aiming to offer people eternal life through constant head transplants. He found a volunteer, a Russian man named Valery Spiridonov, who suffered from a severe degenerative muscle disease and was willing to take the risk. The global medical community reacted to this with reasonable grounds. The surgeon's journal CNS Neuroscience and Therapeutics published a response stating that the spinal cord reconnection problem that stopped Robert White in 1970 had still not been solved. Dozens of leading neuroscientists went on record saying the procedure was, to use the technical term, not yet remotely feasible. Canavero pushed back. The medical community pushed back harder. Spiridonov eventually withdrew from the project after meeting his future wife, and deciding understandably that he'd like to keep his head where it was. As of today, a verified successful human head transplant remains in the realm of science fiction.
From science fact to science fiction.
Emphasis on remains. But here's the thing that keeps scientists, ethicists, and people who think too hard in the shower up at night. The question isn't really whether it's technically possible. Given what Bryukhonenko demonstrated in 1928 with a tray, some tubes, and a machine that looked like it belonged in a plumber's garage, the mechanical principles are not in dispute. Blood pumps, and tissues survive. Neurons fire. The real question is what happens inside the head when all of this is going on. Bryukhonenko himself, the man who started all of this with a machine and a dog, and a question that nobody had thought to ask out loud, was awarded the Lenin Prize in 1965 after his death. I don't know why, but the futuristic experiments of the Soviet Union in the 1960s have always struck me as both frightening and fascinating.